When you think of Paris today, one of the first things that comes to mind is undoubtedly the Eiffel Tower, a symbol of romance, aesthetics, and modernity. Every year, millions of people take photos in front of it, share them on social media, and propose marriage. But while most people gaze at this iron structure in awe, they are unaware of the true story behind it. Because the Eiffel Tower is not just a structure, it is a monument built with the sweat, fear, and struggle for survival of hundreds of nameless workers. When the idea of building this tower in the heart of Paris was first proposed in the late 1880s, the public was shocked. Artists, architects, journalists, everyone protested. They published signed protest letters in newspapers declaring, "This rusty iron monster will ruin Paris's skyline." At the time, the tower was not seen as a source of pride, but as a source of shame. However, the real backlash was not against the design, but against the events that occurred during the construction process. Because the Eiffel Tower was not only an engineering challenge, but also a physical and psychological test for the workers. Hundreds of workers were made to work over 10 hours a day. Without any protective equipment, climbing hundreds of meters high on narrow scaffolding, swaying in the wind, assembling steel parts with their bare hands. The risk of falling, workplace accidents, crush injuries, and illnesses were so widespread that there was no direct connection left between working and living. No one knew their names, no one remembered their faces, but as the Eiffel Tower rose, they were being erased from the pages of history one by one. This video tells the story of those nameless heroes who worked on the tower we admire today. You might be able to spend a day in Paris, but could you endure even a single day on the construction site of the Eiffel Tower? Why was the Eiffel Tower built? By the late 1880s, France was on a mission. The 100th anniversary of the French Revolution was approaching, and the country wanted to erect a monument that would declare to the world, "We are still standing." A major event was planned for this purpose: the 1889 Paris World's Fair. A symbol as striking as the fair itself was needed. This is where Gustave Eiffel came into the picture. Eiffel, who had made a name for himself with railway bridges, came up with a crazy idea: a 300-meter-high tower made of iron. With the technology of the time, this height was almost impossible. In fact, when completed, the tower would be the tallest structure in the world. But the real issue was not just engineering, it was the meaning behind the tower. France wanted to showcase this tower as a symbol of industrial power and progress. However, things did not go as planned. Artists, architects, and writers who heard about the tower were outraged. Some said, "How ugly!" Others shouted, "This is an insult to the honor of this city." In their view, it was like a rusty dagger piercing the aesthetic spirit of Paris. The opposition grew so strong that over 300 prominent figures published a signed statement in newspapers demanding that construction of the tower be halted. But despite all the noise, the French government approved the project. For them, it was not just a tower, but also a message from France to the Western world: we are building the future with iron, science, and courage. And so, amid the debates, the tower's foundation was laid. The Eiffel Tower was no longer just a construction project, but also a challenge. But no one at the time could have predicted that hundreds of workers would pay for this claim with their lives. Pre-construction reactions, public hostility. Even before a single nail was hammered in, the Eiffel Tower had become a hotbed of controversy for the people of Paris. When the design was unveiled to the public, the city was divided into two camps. On one side were engineers and industrialists who believed in the future. On the other were those who wanted to preserve the spirit, history, and aesthetics of Paris. And no, contrary to popular belief, these opponents were not ordinary people. Among them were France's most famous artists, architects, and writers. They were so enraged by Gustave Eiffel's idea of an iron tower that they made comparisons such as driving a stake into the heart of Paris. In 1887, an open letter signed by over 300 artists and intellectuals was published in La Tang, the most popular newspaper of the time. Among them were giants like Guy de Maupassant and Alexandre Dumas the Sun. In the letter, the Eiffel Tower was described as an insult to the aesthetic values of all of Paris, a factory chimney devoid of imagination and visual terror. The backlash spread quickly among the public. Some said they did not want to live under the tower. Others even considered leaving the city. This was not just architectural criticism, it was a sense of humiliation. Parisians were worried that their city was turning into an iron cage, reaching toward the sky. Ironically, despite this massive backlash, the Eiffel project was not halted. Gustave Eiffel not only refused to back down, but took full responsibility for the tower, convincing the government by saying, "I will pay for it out of my own pocket if necessary." The project continued, but the tower was no longer just an engineering marvel. It had become the center of a social conflict. And the first price of this conflict would be paid by the workers who carried the tower's iron skeleton on their backs. Workers' nightmare begins. Primitive conditions. When construction began in 1887, the people of Paris were still debating, but one group remained silent. They did not write letters to newspapers or participate in artistic protests, because they were the hundreds of workers who would build the Eiffel Tower with their own hands. And what awaited them was not a story of architectural success, but a battle for survival. As soon as they stepped onto the construction site, the harsh conditions of the time hit them in the face. There was no safety training, no protective equipment. The workers had to carry the iron bars with their bare hands, climb the scaffolding that rose up to 300 meters with their hands, and work on narrow platforms that could be blown away by the wind at any moment. Items like hard hats, ropes, and safety harnesses, which are mandatory even on an ordinary construction site today, were not even considered luxuries back then. At that time, there was no concept of workplace safety because the worker's life was not considered more valuable than the project. The assembly of the Eiffel Tower was done entirely by hand. Approximately 18,000 iron pieces were to be joined with 2.5 million rivets. And each of these pieces had to be lifted and placed into position by human strength. There were no cranes. There were pulleys, muscle power, and primitive scaffolding systems. Moreover, the working hours were brutal, shifts that began in the early morning and continued until darkness fell, men holding iron in the cold with numb hands, and men riveting in the summer heat with burning hands. But perhaps the most exhausting part was not the physical fatigue. They had to strain not to look down while working at heights, and each new day began with the fear of, maybe today it will be my turn? Because no one knew how to survive a fall from such heights, and there was nothing to catch you if you fell, only the few seconds of silence before hitting the ground, and you. These people were building one of history's most iconic structures, but at the time, they weren't seeking fame or expecting gratitude. Their only concern was returning home safely, but even that wasn't always possible. Surviving in the sky height and the danger of death? The construction site of the Eiffel Tower was 300 meters above the ground, and with the technology of the time, this height was considered one of the craziest feats that could be achieved by human hands. Workers had to climb to heights unimaginable to most people and work while battling the force of the wind. Even looking down from the scaffolding was a daunting task. Which worker would want to assemble iron pieces hundreds of meters in the air, using only their bare hands and sense of balance? At that time, there were almost no safety measures in place. There were no safety harnesses, ropes, or helmets. Workers relied solely on their reflexes and luck, which meant the risk of falling was ever present, every second of every day. They had to set aside their fear of heights, because a moment's hesitation could mean death for them. That's why many workers had to suppress their fears and focus their eyes not on the ground but solely on the task at hand. The death rates were horrific. According to official records, one worker lost their life during the construction process. But the record-keeping methods of that era were very inadequate, and it is estimated that the actual number of deaths was much higher. Falls, crushings, and severe injuries were common occurrences. It is known that several workers were taken to the hospital every day, and sometimes they never returned from the construction site. However, the names of those who lost their lives were not inscribed on any monument or tombstone. They were quietly forgotten in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. This height was not just a physical challenge, it was also a mental battle. As workers risked their lives dancing in the sky, every moment was a struggle for survival. And without all this courage and sacrifice, this dazzling symbol would never have been completed. Accidents, injuries, and hidden losses. The construction of the Eiffel Tower went down in history not only for its height but also for the countless dangers it brought with it. The accidents and injuries that workers experienced in their daily lives seemed to follow them like a shadow as the tower rose. Beyond falls and crush injuries, physical injuries such as exposure to heavy metals, burns, or crush injuries to hands while driving rivets were the workers' fate. Unfortunately, most of these injuries were not documented at the time. There were many unseen and unreported sufferings. Accidents, both minor and major, that occurred during construction changed the lives of workers. Some were left disabled, while others became unable to work. However, most of these individuals were unable to receive compensation or support. Illnesses, infections, and complications arising from poor conditions darkened the lives of workers. However, such losses were invisible in official records. The focus was solely on completing the construction. Another important issue was deaths. While it was officially stated that only one worker died, given the conditions of the era, the actual number is likely to have been much higher. Because at that time, workplace accidents and deaths were often concealed or not reflected in official records. Some workers were dismissed as accidents, while others were simply forgotten as if they had never happened. Their families were often deprived of both material and emotional support. These invisible losses were the dark realities behind the Eiffel Tower's glittering facade. As the tower rose, these sorrows and losses were always present, yet none of them found sufficient place in the pages of history. Today, as we admire the grandeur of the Eiffel Tower, remembering the invisible sacrifices beneath it and keeping their memory alive may be our most important duty. What happened when it was over and the true legacy? When the Eiffel Tower was finally completed, Paris and the world were stunned. The structure, which had been dismissed as a rusty pile of iron, had surprisingly become a symbol of the city. People were amazed by the tower, took photos, and it became one of the most visited places on the planet. However, behind this dazzling finale, the story of the workers who contributed to the tower's construction was largely forgotten. They were hundreds of people whose names did not appear in the pages of history, who sacrificed their lives in its shadow. The Eiffel Tower is not just a structure made of iron and rivets. It is also a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and human resilience. It is not merely an engineering marvel, but a living monument that carries the spirit, dreams, and sorrows of an era. Today, when millions of people gaze upon the Eiffel Tower, remembering the invisible labor and sacrifices behind it is to understand the true legacy of this magnificent structure. In short, the Eiffel Tower is not just Paris's heritage, but humanity's shared heritage. And if you ever visit that tower, think not only of its height and beauty, but also of the story of those who built it. Because one of history's greatest structures was also the product of the greatest sacrifices, you now know that behind the grandeur and magic of the Eiffel Tower lie thousands of forgotten hours of labor, fear, and sacrifice. History is not only written with great buildings or names, but also with the stories of the ordinary people who built them. If you liked my video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. In the comments, you can write which part you found most surprising or which historical structure's story you're curious about. See you in the next video. Take care.